Welcome to the All Creation Podcast, everybody. I'm Chris Searles. I'm the co-founder and executive editor of the All Creation Project. I am extremely excited to welcome both my co-host, Reverend Jimi Calhoun, and our special guest here today, Mr. Scott Sabin, the pioneering leader of plantwithpurpose.org. These are two great men, in my humble opinion, and in my model of what greatness is, which is to say, these guys are bridging the best aspects of our identities here on earth into a more equally cared for community. They are creating kinship and regenerative relationships and moving us forward. Now, a little bit about my co-host, Jimi, or Reverend Calhoun, or Cal, as some of his friends call him. He and I live in the same town here in Texas, and he is a mentor to many of us. But Jimi is unique as a mentor in that he is constantly pursuing what I would call an egalitarian friendship with each of the people he encounters and interacts with. Whether or not they know that, whether or not they reciprocate that, he pursues true equality amongst all of us. And I think he does this because of his Christian beliefs about the creation and all creation. Reverend Calhoun also has an exceptional background. He's just completed his 5th book. It's due out before the end of the year, I believe. He's one of the most important musicians in pop music history. He played on numerous classic albums and songs in the 60s and 70s and was a formative influencer in funk and the related genres in his early life, in his teens and 20s. And then in his 30s, he shifted into ministry about 40 years ago. And Jimi has since worked with Brian McLaren and ministered internationally and pioneered efforts to bring worship to the disabled and the unseen, and in these books about deracializing the church and so much more. So Jimi, thank you for being here. Now let me tell you a little bit about Scott Sabin. Scott is leading an organization that's addressing some of the most complex social problems in the world, and he's doing it at large scale through multifaceted empowerments. And I'll let Scott explain what that is from Plant with Purpose's perspective, what empowerments are as a form of mission. When we started this Called to Care series about a year ago, I really hadn't thought whether or not there was a person who exemplified this idea of leading with care. And I came up with a sort of a quick mnemonic today for what I mean by care: curious, appropriate, responsive, empathetic, nurturing, relational, forward-looking help for ourselves and each other and the other members of the creation, looking at our potential. And so Scott's organization under his leadership has been, in my opinion, rooted in care-based strategies and philosophies and plans and beliefs and investments, essentially asking, I think, Scott, all along in his career, how do we best help these people given the resources we have? And so it is my great pleasure to welcome Scott Sabin. He, like so many people who are listening to this and watching this, who are leading in the world every day and the things they do, Scott has really chosen to succeed through helping others. And in Scott's case, this means building teams and communities in multiple countries in the most isolated and impoverished regions of the world. He's been doing this for about 30 years now. So let me read you his official bio and then I'll get out of the way. Scott is CEO of Plant with Purpose, an international Christian organization that empowers the poor in rural areas around the world where poverty is caused by deforestation. Under Scott's leadership, the organization has grown from a single program in one country to a staff of hundreds of care providers, foresters, agronomists, pastors, and facilitators, now in 9 countries, who then empower regenerative farmers in hundreds of communities in developing countries. Plant with Purpose has planted over 60 million trees now in its 40 years, mostly under Scott's leadership. And in so doing, they have dramatically reduced poverty and its effects where the resources are needed most for these people. Prior to working with Plant with Purpose, Scott served for 7 years in the U.S. Navy. He holds degrees in political science and international relations. His wife is a nurse practitioner who's also served internationally. They have 2 children. And thanks to everyone who is listening and watching. Thanks again to Jimi and Scott for being here. I think all of us understand that we are in the midst of an era of extremely overwhelming, as in too many at once, complex social and personal problems. And part of the issue today is that people don't know how to act effectively. Scott is probably the best in the world at addressing poverty at large scale through ecological solutions that are rooted in a religious commitment to caring for the others in the creation. He's kind of the superstar of this idea of being called to care in terms of being globally impactful. So, Scott, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jimmy. I wouldn't claim any of those titles, but if you add enough qualifiers on it, the best in the world of people doing all those things, who's in San Diego right now. Maybe if you qualify it down far enough, I might. But anyway, no, actually, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And when I say that too, I'm thinking it's easy to think of people I learned from who've been influences here in the United States. We mentioned Brian McLaren earlier. We mentioned, we haven't mentioned, but I think of Tony Campolo and John Perkins and others. But the ones that I really want to call out are our partners in Haiti or Mexico or Dominican Republic. Literally everything we're doing now, we learned from our local partners at some point. Our director in Tanzania taught us how to use savings groups. Jean-Marie, or Dezo, as we call him, taught us how to work with people and work alongside people. So really, when I'm talking about giants, I'm talking about them.
Yes, the people in these communities that you're working with. I was going to say, sort of as a observer comment and thinking of you each as bridging leaders, Jimmy's church is actually called Bridging Austin. But this idea of you going from the developed world to the undeveloped world to help is so important in a lot of the conversations Jimmy and I have had in terms of doing it well from the perspective of the helped, the people who are receiving the help. But then also, you're helping sort of show to people in the developed world what it is to learn from the undeveloped world people, the experts outside of our culture of academia, materialism, and so forth. I would love it if you could talk about that a little bit. But I think it's really important. I think it's important for people in the developed world to understand that we have so much to learn from everyone.
Well, yeah, it is. And it is so easy to approach things as if we had the answers. And I think that's been part of my learning experience in 30 years, is realizing first that we didn't have all the answers. We saw, and I got to give our founder a lot of credit, saw this connection between environmental degradation and rural poverty. I personally was interested in, how can we help people living in, places like the shanty towns outside of Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, or Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and then realizing that so many of them, the vast majority, were essentially refugees from the countryside, people who'd made their living as farmers for generations, and that they were actually coming to those shanty towns because they represented hope, represented a better opportunity. And so going upstream, literally and figuratively, from an ecological perspective, we were literally going upstream to the mountains, but also to the source of some of the problems, realizing this connection between the degradation of the land and extreme poverty. Then along the way, realizing that we only had a very narrow piece of the story, and to really understand the story, it needed to be much more of an equal exchange and much more dialogue. Just to give a sense of what we do after many years, we use something we call a purpose group, but it's based on savings groups, which allow 20 to 30 families to gather together and mobilize their savings. And I can go into more detail on any of these. things. So we don't consider that we do relief, but we rather do development work. And we used to do microfinance where we'd make loans. And again, it was our director in Tanzania, Edith, who was talking to me about the fact that she was having a hard time teaching agriculture. People didn't want to come to our seminars, and they didn't want to come to any Bible studies because they all felt like they owed us money because we were making these microfinance loans. So she researched and found the savings group model, which we didn't develop, but she found other organizations using it and brought it to my attention. She says, Scott, it's so beautiful. We don't give them any money. And these women will come and they'll bring 25 cents a week. And I have to admit, I was a total skeptic at that point. I said, come on, Edith, 25 cents a week. How's that ever going to amount to anything? But she ran a couple pilots, and it was absolutely amazing how that empowered people and how they gained a much greater sense of agency. And today we have I think it's about 4,000 of those groups worldwide, those savings groups, with a combined total of $12 million that they're investing in their own communities. Money that belongs to them, they raise themselves, they're investing it, and they're making about an 18 to 20% return on their investments in their own communities, in their own businesses, in their own neighbors. So that was sort of one of the first building blocks. And then that group we used to teach regenerative agriculture and agroforestry. So most of the trees that have been planted by farmers on their farms because they make sense to restore soil, to halt erosion, to provide fruit, to provide other products, including firewood and timber. But they're planting the trees for their own use on their own farms. And that's now, I think we're at almost 62 million trees have been planted by our participants. And then the third part is that those groups often become spiritual communities, and we offer assistance to the local churches, and we offer training around care of God's creation and purpose and identity in Jesus and reconciliation. So that's it in a nutshell.
That's really beautiful. And maybe we can transition over to talking about this idea of inclusivity, kind of inclusivity that Jimi and I have been talking about, meaning I've been listening and learning from Jimi about his new book and what he's been thinking about, is far broader than the sort of current political conversation on this meeting. So Jimi, could you maybe pick it up and talk about this idea? And
well, I think that it's multi-pronged actually, and ironically, as we spoke earlier, and Scott and I shared a little a connection through Central America, and he being in Guatemala and myself becoming an embedded Christian missionary to the country of Belize, is where I sort of had my eyes open to two things, poverty, as well as, I hate to say, but Western arrogance. I went down very sure and certain of myself, and I thought I was going to lift, because that's what I'd been taught in the seminary, that you go down, it's redemption and lift. You go down and you bring something to them and you elevate. And after about 2 or 3 years, I realized that I had more to learn from them than they had to learn from me. And the first thing that I learned was to actually value people as you find them. And that's a hard thing to do. And I can tell you one quick story. I was supposed to identify a national, I think as they were called then, and then establish a church and identify this one person to take over for me. And I would go ahead and move on to, I think it was Jamaica at the time or something. So I found this Maya guy, and I found he was out doing lawn work one day, and I used to run, and I'd run by, and I noticed him. So every morning I was out running, he was out doing some lawn, and so I said, "You out here every morning?" He goes, "Yeah." And he says, I said, "Well, what's your name?" He says, "My name's Landy." I said, "Oh, I heard Jimmy." So I said, "Yeah, my name's Jimmy too." And he thought, "Oh, well, you're the first guy I've ever met that had the same name as me." So we became famous friends. And in my living room, he was telling me he had this vision for out by the Guatemalan border at a place called Cayo, close to Melcher, that he wanted to establish a Christian camp and bring all these, except he didn't have any education. So after 3 or 4 years, the bosses, my bosses, came down from Los Angeles to meet the guy I'd identified to take my place. And they came down, and then we're sitting in my living room, and I introduced him to this guy. He's about 5'5", and he's not very sophisticated, and he just come from work, and his clothes are so. And they looked at him, and they looked at me, and the air left the room. And what they didn't realize that this guy was entrepreneurial as all get out. He just came in different packaging than they were used to, and he had a use of different vocabulary. And right then I realized that you need to learn to value, not only give them dignity, ascribe dignity to them, but value every single human being that you come in contact with, every single one, irrespective of gender, skin color, height, vocabulary, nationality. All of those adjectives just need to go by the wayside. And that changed everything for me. And so that's been the mission of bridging. And typically the response I get, or the pushback, is that, well, you're naive. Or you're an old hippie and you think the world can just be full of love and everybody sing Kumbaya or something like that. And no, you're really missing the point. There is so much for you to enjoy about every human being that you come in contact every day with, that you're actually missing. I'm trying to do you a favor by alerting you to something. I mean, there's just a beauty. And so we're trying to welcome people. And the kind of welcome we mean is taking them as who they are, and taking their needs and wants into consideration. And we're there to serve them. They're not to be plugged into our church, which was a lot of the vocabulary. You got to invite people and plug them in. Well, I do that to my light switch in my guitar and my amp, but I'm never going to plug a human being in. I'm going to welcome them in. And so we've developed this new model, which is disconcerting for a lot of people here, because they don't know really what they're supposed to do. And they've never lived outside of the country where you're forced to. I mean, when you're inserted into a different culture, you have two things. You have two choices, and either try to convert them to what you are bringing to them, or allow yourself to be stretched a little bit and be converted to their way of living. And so that's been the thing for Bridging Austin. And I was struck by something that Scott said earlier, and from a straight mission context, it was beautiful. He says, we had to learn when we were hurting people more so than we were helping. And from my background, being a denominational missionary guy, had that sentence in what year did I go? 1991. Just to alert people that there's a possibility when you go you're sending out all these missionary units, that you better reevaluate and be sensitive and humble. So if I could say two things about Bridging Austin, it's sensitivity and humility. I mean, those are our bywords.
I love that. Yeah, I think humility is probably one of the most important things. In many of the countries where we work, there's a real prejudice against subsistence farmers. They were the ones who were not smart enough to go to school, wouldn't, couldn't get jobs, stayed behind. A lot of times they're stigmatized by their own governments as backward. I mean, sometimes you see that here in the U.S. as well, but there it's to the degree that I think people almost take that on as an identity, And so the idea that God gives everybody gifts, everybody talents, and we know that, and that they're created with purpose, and one of the most gratifying things to me has been seeing people come alive as they realize their talents and realize what they have to offer. We use the phrase all the time. The people we work with are our partners, not our projects. And I think that's probably one of our most important learnings and one of our most important messages. Once we realize that, like you said, Jimmy, we have as much to learn from them or more than we have to offer. And it's in working together that anything's accomplished.
Yeah, that bias against subsistence farmers or people who lack education. We went down, there weren't very many cars when we went to Belize. There just hadn't been there weren't there. And so we took down a Isuzu Trooper, which there were only 4 others in the country.
Oh, wow.
And most of the cars there didn't have duplicates. So, there wasn't a car parts store that was stocking a lot of things on the shelves in hopes of some future customer needing it. Our car broke one time, and there was a guy around the corner. He wore like a coolie hat, this big round hat.
Yeah.
And he worked on cars, and I took it over to him, and he says, "Well, I have to call Napa Parts, and it'll take about 6 weeks." I said, "Okay, well, Belize City was small enough, and we had difficulty finding places to go to entertain ourselves because it was only 4 miles square. So there wasn't. So about 3 days later, he comes over and he says, "Your car's ready." And I said, "Well, I thought you needed to wait 6 weeks for the part." He says, "Yeah, but then I looked at it again and I figured I'd just make one." So I made a part. And I know that had I taken him and we gotten on a plane and I brought him back to the States and introduced him to all my educated friends, they would have looked at Castillo and looked at him and said, "What's up with this guy?"
Yeah.
Except that he was used to living in an atmosphere where if you needed something, you had to be resourceful enough to do it. And so the ingenuity doesn't come from regurgitating what came in. It comes from your observation and what you're able to do with what you see. So there's a creative element, and so it's yeah. I'll just leave it there.
That's a great story. Yeah, it's true. I think, a lot of times we have all of these advantages and we tend to own those as if they were part of who we are. The old story of the guy who is I'm trying to remember how it goes. The guy who was what, born on third base and thought he'd hit a triple or something. I don't remember exactly how that goes. Anyway, but no, you most of us couldn't survive
Correct.
in the environments that you know. So people who, you know, we might look at as uneducated or that might be discriminated against by their own governments are incredibly resourceful and you know, are managing to survive in conditions that would kill us, and they've got a lot to teach us.
Yeah. And I guess that runs on the same rails as why we have a tendency to objectify everything. It's just, you know, we like the planet we're living on and other human beings, they become objects to use and to produce and consume, and that ever-ending cycle of almost like what's in it for me or us collectively in my small little bubble. And that doesn't seem to bode well from a guy who believes that the created order with being a Christian is not a matter of receiving, but there's a level of responsibility that comes inherent with it, attached. You know, as soon as I say that word, that means I'm putting people on notice that I have a responsibility to love you as you are, to serve you when I can, and to love you whatever it is that you need. And that's what I mean, and bridging means when we say the word Christian. And
I love it.
Yeah. So
I've become convinced that part of our purpose is to serve others. And one of the most exciting things to me is watching some of the people we work with discover their purpose. There's a story from one of my first visits to Congo, and it was 2017, I think 2016, and we were working in these 3 villages located along this steep river valley up into the mountains, really steep. And so it's the 3-day walk up to the edge of the forest and back. And our local director, Birori, tells me, he says, Scott, there have not been a lot of outsiders in this area in decades because of the conflict. So we're going to draw a lot of curiosity, and it's okay. It's a public road. And so there are going to be a lot of people walking with us. Well, like public road was like a single track thing. But anyway, we had about 50 men follow us and camp with us on the edge of the forest on the last night. And Birori tells me, he says, you know, the guy who's been helping you carry your backpack for the last 2 days used to be one of the guerrilla leaders. And so I asked him if I could interview him. So we sit down in this tent, and he says to me, you know, the men here didn't do much. We'd sit around and play cards while the women did all the work. And then your pastor came, and by our pastor, he was talking about a Congolese pastor, guy by the name of Sibomana, who's like one of my heroes in the world. But then Sibomana came and started talking about work being a gift from God. And he says, and I thought, maybe if I help my wife on the farm, together we could do something great. And he talked then about disarming the militia, and I'm coming from a kind of an evangelical background. I said, so did you become a Christian? Is that what changed? No, I've always been a Christian. I just never realized it applied to the rest of my life. I thought it was just about Sunday. And I've kept up with him more or less in the years since, and he's really discovered purpose in restoring the watershed that he depends on and everybody downstream depends on, and being an agent for reconciliation and peace. He's obviously, as a guerrilla leader, he's got some charisma, and he goes community to community preaching ideas of reconciliation. And to me, it was like the aha moment for him was, I realized I have gifts to offer.
Wonderful story.
It's beautiful. And I want to try to jump in and highlight one thing for you guys to kind of bounce around a little bit. This thing you said, Scott, that's so powerful. And Jimi is a craftsman, right? And so on and so forth. So this is one of the ways it ties together. This idea that work is a gift. And kind of the context Jimi and I are coming out of is that the American culture is sort of oriented towards not helping itself right now, and the work that you're doing is really setting a model. So there's shame around work for a lot of people. You shouldn't do labor, these kinds of things. That's for a lower class of person or something like that. And the reality is, it's a gift. You can make the world as you wish. You can build relationships. It's not easy or anything, but we should get back into I think a culture that takes pride in potential.
Yeah. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Jimi.
Well, we have a saying in the Iona community that in work and worship, you find God, I guess. And as it relates to just looking at the world holistically and thinking about that everything you do does have a purpose. It doesn't necessarily have to be identified as a job, but with that responsibility of what you do, even when you're off hours, there's a job to do then, and there's work to be done 24/7, I guess is the way I would say it. And that you would have to, redefine the word work, because I don't see serving another person as work any longer. I mean, early on when I was getting a denominational paycheck, they talked in terms of, well, you got to put 60 hours in, but make sure everything was quantified, and they had a bracket for this. And since I left that world, I'm on 24/7, and I never think of any call I make or any conversation I have or anything like that as being work. And it's all geared towards improving the lives of somebody else, and in whatever way they need it. Chris and I have a lot of conversations about music, and the conversations we have don't really ever pertain to us becoming better players, but it makes us better people, because we stretch ourselves, and we're only using the conversation about Miles Davis or Thelonious Monk for a broader purpose, to get something else done. And that's how work can be as well, so.
I love it. My thought is that I don't want to romanticize things. If we look at the account in Genesis and the fall, there's also a curse that comes with it, right? And so you can romanticize work. There's a lot of places and a lot of people where work is drudgery or slavery or serves no purpose or is abusive. So I don't want to romanticize that, but I do think that at its best and in the kingdom of God, there's an alignment between purpose and what we do, and that we were made to be co-creators. And so that the point, and I think for us, one of the exciting things about working with subsistence farmers is there is an opportunity for creativity in how you work with the land. So it can be much more creative per se than going to the city and trying to get a job in a garment factory. Again, I don't want to romanticize. It's hard being a subsistence farmer on a barren hillside somewhere in East Africa is hard, and it's easy for me sitting here in a nice, cool place to romanticize it, and I don't want to do that. But
yeah, there is that tension. I know exactly what you're saying. It's this one lady in Belize that we call her the banana lady, and the bananas you bought, there were either 5 or 10. I don't know if I remember, but they in U.S. would probably be 3 cents. And she sat in this open market, and with, like, you can imagine, flies and excrement dogs, and I mean, and she sat there every day, every single day. And Jelaine and I would go by, and we would be the only people that stop after we purchased our bananas and talk to her. And she looked forward to our coming every day because we'd spend 20 or 30 minutes with her and talk, and nobody ever saw her as a person. They just saw her as somebody sitting there that had a commodity they needed. And her work wasn't very satisfying, but her work was very needed by the people there because otherwise they wouldn't eat. So I get this, my whole concept of the import, and even I guess the definition of work. I know what you mean by not want to romanticize, but we have a tendency we're very comparative by nature, I guess, in the West. In the last book, and my forthcoming book, I talk about how the indentured Irish came in early America, and they were doing basically the same jobs that the enslaved Africans were doing in close proximity to each other. But even in that, they had to make a distinction so that one felt elevated above the other. And I found, besides the sadness that we would do that, I saw the humor in ourselves that we would even think to do that as a culture, as a society. So work around the world is what you said, Scott, is serving a purpose. The banana lady in Belize is serving the same purpose as the IBM exec here in Austin over here making the iPhone that I use. I guess I should have said Apple. I got in trouble.
Now we're going to get blocked.
Yeah, right. I don't want to get sued for misappropriating a copyright infringement, but yeah, that.
Yeah. Well, I think some of our work, to use work in a different sense, some of our work is to bring good news of redemption and to offer redemptive opportunities. I mean, it's, I don't want to set ourselves up as the redeemers. We're not, but we can bring good news of redemption and offer opportunities, I think, to redeem work.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. I got to go to Kenya in May with Sam and Melody from Africa Exchange.
Yeah.
And it was my first time to see colonization from the real inside of it, because they have a similar model. They go to these isolated communities. And so to your point about work being, extremely oppressive in places, I do appreciate you guys both sort of bringing that out. And then also I think, maybe we can shift over to talking a little bit more about poverty. Jimmy asked this really good question, how, Scott, do you define poverty in the question that in the conversation he and I were having ahead of time? And then also in light of that sort of, so in the Christian model, caring for the least of these can mean a lot of different things. So how you look at this, Scott, or how Plant with Purpose looks at this?
Yeah. Well, and Jimmy, I see that you talk about poverty as a state of hopelessness.
I have used that. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's that resonates with me. I trying to remember whose literature I was reading, but comparing Western definitions of poverty, which tend to be a lot about lack of material things,
Correct.
and those of the global South talking about poverty, and it tends to be much more attitude, hopelessness, discouragement, embarrassment,
Yes.
invisibility, all of those things. So to me, one of the things I think is and this is my definition now, is a lack of agency or perceived agency and opportunity, which can be closely connected to hopelessness. If you're hopeless, you don't exercise what agency you might have.
I reckon that. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that we do in our small groups is the very first question, when the missional impulse hit the States about the early 2000s, most of the churches here were into going out and serving, and serve. And you found that on the website, serving teams, serving opportunities. And we were there as well. But the very first question I would ask our people is, what do you think about poverty? What does poverty mean to you when you hear that word? And for some reason, every time that word was broached, it would come back in economic terms.
Mm-hmm.
And like we're economic beings. Well, poverty has more components to it than economics. And so that agency you're talking about and that hopelessness, there are people I know from my recording industry days that they were hopeless and impoverished solely inside of their soul and empty, even though they had everything at their disposal economically at their fingertips. And so it's hard for people to realize that it is possible to be impoverished, even in the midst of what seems to be a lot. You can be impoverished. But conversely, that hopelessness carries over and seems to intensify, when there's the monetary component is factored in. And how that plays out is attitudinally. I mean, my first year in ministry, I spent at the Union Rescue Mission down in LA. And every week I would go down and hang out with the guys and it took me a long time to realize that they were acting just as they should. They were hopeless, everything. They were so far off the grid. I thought I could come down and offer some pointers on how they could improve this and touch this up and do this. And that's not what they needed. They needed somebody to come along and say, I understand your attitude. I get why you see the world the way you do, because you're hopeless. And there's not a lot of good options out there in your horizon. You don't see a way out of this.
Right.
And if I can get to that, if I pull back to that level where I can say I identify with it, at least we can, what was the baseball analogy? We can start the way to first base, not heck with third base. We can start going to, like the first base together, but it's always that together that has to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your comment about those who were economically wealthy but spiritually impoverished is important. I think one of the things that we have learned and is actually a part of our theory of change is that, well, we mentioned earlier, we have stuff to learn, but that we don't come we come in many ways impoverished as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really interested. I don't want to take us off topic, but your Union Rescue Mission.
Yeah, Andy?
No, but did you ever cross paths with Ken McGill or Leslie Sabin?
Leslie sounds familiar.
Leslie's my sister. Ken is her husband now. So they're Ken and Leslie
Oh,
McGill up in Dallas, down in what direction is Dallas from y'all? Anyway,
North.
in Dallas. Anyway, they actually met working there at the rescue mission.
down in Los
Really?
Angeles. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. That's
Yeah.
So I don't know what that would have. I don't know if you would have overlapped. Ken was chaplain there for a while.
I think I was here in 80. Well, I'm going to date myself. 87, 6.
Okay, might have. I'll have to check with them. Sorry, Chris.
No.
Your editing more challenging, but anyway.
This is all staying in there.
Okay.
Well, speaking of third base and stuff, it's about time to shift into the third segment, the home stretch. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to open this topic up of the future we choose, which is a book title I like, and again, back to empowerment, and the brighter side of work when you are, like me, in a position of economic privilege where you can really choose your work. This idea of potential is currently very lacking in the way so many of the conversations we're having about solving problems seems to be discussed. It's more often fear, how the heck are we going to handle this difficult thing? And Scott, your book, your first book, you may be pretty close to finishing the second one. But your first book, which I recommend to everyone, Jimmy mentioned earlier, is called Tending to Eden: Environmental Stewardship for God's People. And to me, as an ecologist, I mean, this is like the best title in the world, because I really understand that biospherically, the planetary systems are designed to renew. We're just sitting on top of potential all the time. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, in this context of choosing a good future and so forth, what you sort of mean in a nutshell about tending to Eden. Can we make the future better through environmental care? We've talked very broadly about stuff, but you're affecting communities, you're affecting society in positive ways, by most metrics. But anyway, I'd just love to hear from you about that area.
Yeah. Well, first, this is a lesson that I learned from farmers in the Dominican Republic, but that first we saw a vicious cycle between environmental degradation and the impoverishment of their farms. The land, the soil was eroded, the water, ran off and didn't infiltrate the soil, and so they weren't able to grow what they needed. So we had a vicious cycle. What I learned from them is that there is a possibility in creating a virtuous cycle and actually a win-win. And I think too oftentimes when we look at human need and in environmental issues, we see it as very much as a zero-sum game. If people benefit, the environment is hurt. If the environment is helped, people are hurt. And I think that there's tremendous potential if we seek it. Well, I've got three things. If we seek out the win-win, if we approach it from a spirit of abundance rather than scarcity. I think scarcity leads us to hoard and leads us to strip the land and book Breeding Sweetgrass. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about the principle of reciprocity. Easy for you to say. Reciprocity. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to say that all again so that you can. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about the principle of reciprocity, and you have to have a sense of abundance before you can give back. Otherwise, you want to keep and hold it all for yourself. And so I think that spirit of abundance is important. And then I think the last thing, which is particular to us, is those we serve. And there's nearly 1 billion people who make their living as subsistence farmers, growing their own food, living off what they can grow. Is probably the greatest untapped resource in the world. They have so much to offer, and so much creativity, and they're the ones who are planted 61 million trees, not us. I mean, we've been the catalyst, but in some ways, but they're the ones who planted the trees, and they are like I say, our partners, not our projects. So
yeah, wow, beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about this potential? Jimmy and I gave you, really for simplicity of our preparation for talking with you, gave you the title of a global poverty expert. So you may not feel comfortable with that, but you are working in 9 countries.
Yes.
In extremely impoverished and under-resourced communities. So I'm curious if you can talk about this idea of potential through the ecological means and community building that you're doing as a global poverty solution, but also as a priority for communities of faith that they can utilize locally. The techniques, the mindset, and so on and so forth, that we need to support the work that you're doing and others like you, but we also need to implement where we are some of the same ideas. Can you talk about how these things cross over a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, and I'm used to thinking in an international context, so it's always a bit more challenging to think about how it might apply in a U.S. context. But I think, first of all, looking for the win-win. The other thing, I think, as communities of faith, we're good news, or we're intended to be good news for creation, right? Romans says that creation waits for the children of God to be revealed. I don't know exactly what that means, but it does mean that in some way we are, as communities of faith, as Christians, are intended to be good news for creation. And in the Great Commission, as it's given in the Gospel of Mark, is to go out and preach the good news to all of creation. So again, we're supposed to be good news to all of creation. What does that look like in practice? Are we, in our communities of faith, life-giving or death-dealing? And I think there's a lot of times where we think of this as secondary or a distraction, where we can be a living witness to the kingdom of God, bringing good news to all of creation. So, yeah, I think that's one way that we can think about where we have church, how we relate to our community, how we prioritize things in our community. To your earlier question about global poverty, where I'm definitely not an expert is at the policy level. I made a very conscious decision to get involved at the grassroots level, at the community level, because I thought it would be easier than policy. We've learned that there's a lot of pitfalls there too, but if nothing else, you can see the impacts. And I've seen, poverty dramatically reduced at the same time that I've seen, forests return and rivers begin to flow again, and fruitfulness return to the land. And I think that is scalable. Right now, we are directly serving about 400,000 or 500,000 people, have an impact from what we've been able to measure, have a measurable impact on just over 1 million people. But as I said, nearly 1 billion people make their living as subsistence farmers. So the potential to scale this and to serve many, that's where I get really excited.
Me too.
Sorry, and it also as it has a local impact and as it's restoring forests locally, it has a global impact. Forests and fertile soil sequester carbon and have an impact on climate change. And so I've seen local farmers, people who may not even be literate, get excited about the fact that they're having a positive impact on the climate. And they're aware of climate change. I hear farmers talk about how the climate is changing all the time. And they get excited that we're doing something not just for our community, not just digging in the dirt to try and eke out a living for my family, but I'm doing something for the planet.
That's tremendous. It really is. I mean, if you just think about the feeling of that, back to this bridging word, you're connecting those people to a sense of global identity. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more we could say about that. I have one more question for you. Jimmy, would you prefer to have the last word or the second to last word?
I prefer the second to last word.
Okay.
Well, as I heard Scott sharing and his conscious decision not to get involved in policy, I can certainly relate to that because I kind of made the same decision at two levels, the political as well as, there's certain things that I don't have expertise in. And what we talk about around here is that perception precedes perspective. And really what that means is, like, for Chris and I are simpatico. We're really close. And yet I know if I brought him to a lot of evangelical churches and he shared his perspective, they would not understand it because of their perception. And that's why my work is to try to change people's attitudes about how they see people with different skin color. This is the attitude that needs changing, and that's my role. And now as I'm hearing Scott share, I know the same thing would happen if I were to go and share and say, well, listen, I met a guy online, he's doing all this wonderful work around here, there, and I rattle off all these countries. And because their perception of what poverty is, they would go, so? Their perspective they would not be able to grasp the import. And so I just wanted to say that you've ignited a fire in me today. And so thank you for this time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. The inspiration I get from both of you all is profound. I want to repeat for the audience that Scott said very humbly a moment ago that they're helping around 1 million people now indirectly and around 500,000 people directly with their programs. Again, this is a man who started with one program in one country a few decades ago and has been able to really build this incredible thing that, back to the point you left off on a moment ago, Scott, it's exciting. I just get so excited about, wow, look what Scott did in 30 years. Where could we be in 30 more years? Because now we have a template. And the template is rooted, another way that you and I have talked about this, and I'm wrapping up here, but another way you and I have talked about this is it's rooted in altruism. And so the faith aspect of it allows for the development pieces to be about the people inside of the project, about the life, the other organisms, about the long term, as opposed to short-term economic returns and these kinds of things. And that is the model that is a piece that has to some degree been lacking in the way the academic world and the policy world have viewed creating opportunities for people. They've looked at it, as Jimmy said, more of like an economic exercise. And your model is so much more about the whole person, about the families and so forth. And they're learning from you, obviously, over these last decades. But I appreciate it so much. And so for anyone in the audience, please check out Jimmy's work at bridgingaustin.org and jimicalhoun.com. But please check out plantwithpurpose.org. Look for Scott's books and so forth. And his other interviews and the other content from Plant with Purpose on the web, because again, they really are leading 500,000 people are being affected by this care-based work. The last question I have for you, Scott, is a big, simple one. I like big, simple questions. So I'm wondering if you can speak to, the people of faith or people in general about a singular priority. If you had to choose one priority in light of the environmental and social problems that we're trying to solve now, what would it be? You sort of spoke to this a moment ago when you were talking about being called to share the good news. But anyway, what would your, the one thing you wish everyone knew and was acting on be?
Wow. um, we spend so much time trying to hold in balance both the poverty work and the faith outreach and the environmental, that pulling out one. But I think that might be what I'm most excited about, is you don't have to see it as a zero-sum game. Actually, those three things are, there's a synergy between them. I think that people are one of the reasons that people are sticking with the work is because they see it as an outgrowth of our faith. In fact, our director in Tanzania has told me that a lot of tree planting programs, they pay people to plant trees, they stop paying people to plant trees, the trees stop getting planted. Our people, or people we work with, I should say, see it as actually something they do to take care of their watershed. So all that to say, probably the overarching thing is there's good news. I see good news. I see good news every single day, and I get really excited about it. I'm blessed in that on Sunday I'm headed to the Dominican Republic. I'm going to be visiting some of the people and some of the families that I first saw 30 years ago when we were only working with 80 families. Earlier this year, I got to go to Oaxaca, Mexico, where we visited a place, a hillside that was completely barren, and we were putting these little tiny seedlings in the hillside. And I remember thinking, this is futile. I mean, like, what are we doing this for? And today, well, this spring, I walked through a forest with trees that were 40 feet high. The smell of pine needles and the trees, and birds perching in the branches, and the farmer talking about the biodiversity that returned, and the stream that was flowing, and the deer that had come back. And I think too often people look at the environmental issue and issues of global poverty and look at both of those as hopeless. Just like those we serve. If we see it as hopeless, we lose our agency. It's not hopeless.
Yeah, I'm excited about the future. I think we have an enormous bunch of stuff we got to do real fast together, and the hardest part is doing it together. But I am very excited. I think we have a lot of good things figured out, and leaders, among us all over the place. And then I think to wrap up on a big idea for me right now, something you each have said, everyone is important, everyone is gifted. I think we're all geniuses here, and we just haven't created a context where that can really, really be utilized, the full symphony of potential or something like that. I don't want to let you guys go just because I'm such a huge fan. But to everyone listening here, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been a great pleasure for me to bring these two guys together and get them conversing and so forth. And just wishing everyone the best as we move forward in this pursuit of care. Thank you, Scott, so much for your work with Plant with Purpose. Please check out the other podcasts on allcreation.org. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you.